and open perspectives for the future. So I'll let Mr. Michel Touma speak. And hello, Mr. Touma.
Hello, thank you, Sandra. I'm sorry for the camera. I don't know what's the problem, but that's okay.
Excuse me.
Can you hear me clearly?
Asking if we're recording.
Excuse me. Yes, I am recording. Go ahead.
Okay.
Yes, we are hearing you very well, Mr. Touma. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Sandra. So, as far as I'm concerned, I will talk about the issue of political confessionalism, and I will try to point to the relation between the Lebanese identity and communitarism or confessionalism, political confessionalism in Lebanon, because I think there is a clear link between the confessionalism and the Lebanese identity. So what we call communitarism as a system of government and participation of religious communities in the process of decision-making and sharing of power, this is what we mean by confessionalism. Here I would like to first to clarify an important point. The term communitarism that I will use here does not have the same meaning as in the West countries, where especially in Europe, where the term of communitarism has a pejorative or negative meaning. Especially in France, they are very sensitive about this idea of communitarism. But here in Lebanon, communitarism means another thing. It means participation of all communities, and I mean by religious communities, in the governing structure and the decision-making and sharing of power. So I think it's important to clarify this point. And that brings us to the second point I would like to clarify also. We are here in the Middle East, of course, where the three monotheist religions were born. So in this region, the relation with religion is very deep, maybe deeper than in Europe. I think this is obvious for all of us, and we all live it every day, this religion between the citizens and the religion. And even in Western countries, I think they live this also every day. In addition to these very deep relations with religion, in Lebanon, family, tribal and clanic and local ties are also still very strong. And what we mean by family, what I mean by family, I mean by big families like the Frangi or the Jumblat or the Arslan. Yeah? And what we mean by tribal or clanic ties, you know that in many regions we have very big clanic families like the Hamadi or the Musawi or the Dandash or the Zaidi. These are clanic big entities, and the ties between the members of these clanic entities are also very strong. So the link to traditional values and clanic and family traditions, and mainly family traditions, is also very obvious in Lebanon. All these facts create what we can call a strong, I don't know if the term is appropriate, a strong body spirit. In French, we call it esprit de corps. I don't know if the term of body spirit is in the same thing. And to make it clear, I will quote Ibn Khaldun. You know, Ibn Khaldun is a born Tunisian historian. He called this esprit de corps the Asabiyya. The Asabiyya is the link between big big families or big clanic entities. I think here in the region, the Asabiyya, not only in Lebanon, in many Arab countries also, we have this Asabiyya, this body spirit between some social entities. Now, considering these remarks, it's clear that communitarism in Lebanon and the confessional system have deep roots that go back a long way in history. And to understand the roots of communitarism in Lebanon and the region in general, but mainly in Lebanon, we must go back as far as the 7th century, during the Islamic conquest. This Arab Islamic conquest led to the emergence of a Muslim state that was established in the actual Middle East and Northern Africa. And this Muslim state has for centuries classified the populations under its control into two categories: believers, that is Muslims, and dhimmis, mainly Christians and Jews. And this Muslim state granted the dhimmis, so the Christians and Jews, a special legal status that allowed them to preserve their freedom for practicing their religion and their freedom to keep their traditions, their properties, to manage their own internal affairs, including personal status, the civil, what we call the civil status, on the condition that they pay the jizya. We call it the jizya. It's a tax to the authority, to the Islamic State, and in condition that they make an act of submission to the Islamic State. So this particular status has had the effect of generating over time, over a very long time, community identities specific to Christians and Jews. I mean that the Christian and Jews, because of this special status given to them by the Islamic State, this special status made a community identity specific to Christians and Jews. And that's why many historians say that the foundation of the community or confessional system were led by the Muslim state in the 7th century. Now, if you come to modern time, it's clear and obvious that among all the countries of the Middle East, it is in Lebanon that the confessionalism system has taken its full dimension because of social realities and because throughout history, this country, Lebanon, has always been a land of welcome and refuge for persecuted minorities in the region. And that's why Michel Chiha said that Lebanon is a country of associated confessional minorities, un pays de minorités confessionnelles associées. That vocation of Lebanon was facilitated by geographical characteristics of the Lebanese territory, which played a fundamental role in this vocation of Lebanon. If we look at a map of Lebanon, it's obvious that we can easily notice that the high mountains range along a 200-kilometer long coastline stretching from north to south. These mountains have been a sort of barrier, allowing the population to resist the invaders and foreign occupations. This factor, this geographic characteristic linked to high mountains, has contributed over the years to this asabiyya, or the body spirit of the population in these mountains, and it helped to forge a Lebanese personality or identity based mainly on religious communities. In addition to the impact of the geographical factor on the behavior of the population, An important geopolitical factor has also contributed at a large extent to the consolidation of the confessionalism in Lebanon. And this factor was the Ottoman conquest in 1516. The new Ottoman power increased the privileges enjoyed by the Mount Lebanon during the Mamluk regime. The Lebanese, mainly Maronites and Druze, were thus able to continue their religious life and to maintain their social cultural traditions. The autonomy granted by Istanbul to Mount Lebanon it's obvious that it has strengthened the role of the clergyman and has thus further consolidated communitarism at both the Maronite and Druze level. And this has also consolidated the identity of each community. This de facto communitarism system was limited until the 19th centuries to the management of the affairs of daily life. It first took an institutional form after the clashes between Maronites and Druze in Mount Lebanon in 1842 and 1845. In order to put an end to the sectarian unrest, a special political regime was established in 1842, providing for the division of Mount Lebanon into two zones known as Qa'im Maqamat, one Maronite and the other Druze. A joint community council has been formed in each Qa'im Maqama, including 12 members representing the main communities. So for many historians, this formula of the two Qa'im Maqama was the starting point on the political level. It was the starting point of confessionalism in Lebanon as a system regulating the participation of communities in the power sharing and decision making. So we are in 1842. So the confessionalist system, because many people think that the confessionalism is the result of the civil war in Lebanon in 1975. So this is absolutely wrong. Confessionalism began, if we don't want to speak about the 7th century, it began as a political system in 1842. But the formula of the two Qa'im Maqama did not put an end to the sectarian troubles, which instead took a particularly serious turn in 1845 and 1860. And the large-scale massacres have occurred in several parts of the mountain and even in Damascus, where Christians have been the victims of mass murders. To stop the massacres of 1860, in June 1861, the five great powers of the time, France, England, Russia, Austria, and Prussia, and the Ottoman Empire, adopted a new political system or regime for Lebanon. It was the first time that an international guarantee has adopted a new political system. It was the Mutasarrifiyya, which was once again institutionalized the community system with the cover and guarantee of the five powers. So the Mutasarrifiyya was set in 1861, and it was maintained till the First World War, till 1917, I think. Lebanon has been ruled by a Mutasarrif beginning in 1861, a Mutasarrif, a governor, appointed by Istanbul. And this governor or Mutasarrif had to be an Ottoman subject, of course, non-Lebanese, but Christian and specifically Catholic. It had to be a Catholic governor. He was assisted by a community board of directors made of 12 elected members representing the confessional communities. All these developments have resulted in further consolidation of community identity. As a result, when Lebanon was placed under French mandate after the First World War, France decided to reorganize Lebanon politically and administratively on the basis of the existing community regime. Thus, the Charter of the Mandate, approved on July 1922 by the Council of the League of Nations, stipulates in Article 6 that, quote unquote, respect for the personal status of the various populations and their religious interests will be guaranteed. Article 9 also explicitly prohibits the foreign power from, and quote unquote, again, it prohibits the foreign power from any intervention in the management of the religious communities of the various religions, whose immunities are expressively guaranteed. So this Charter of the Mandate was an international recognition of the community system. So as part of this political reorganization initiated by France, the year 1926 saw the birth of the first Lebanese constitution. The document explicitly recognized the confessional or community system. Article 9 in the Constitution stresses that freedom of conscience is absolute and the state respects all confessions and guarantees and protects their free exercise. As well as the Constitution guarantees the people, whatever community they belong to, that it's guaranteed a total respect of their personal status and religious interests. So all these constitutional articles clearly reflected that these articles were adopted because they reflected the reality on the ground. This reality is a profound link between the society and the community reality. And the proof of that is in 1926, the French High Commissioner Maurice Sarrail, who was anti-clerical, showed a complete ignorance of the realities of the society. And he decided to abolish the confessional representation in the representative council in charge of developing the organic status of Lebanon. So this decision to abolish the confessional representation caused a strong opposition between the Lebanese people. And this opposition was so strong that the French government was forced to put aside Sarrail and to replace him by Henri de Jouvenel, who immediately reinstalled the representative council in accordance with the confessional criteria. So all these facts show that through centuries and going back far in history, we see that the specific identity of the communities has been maintained and even strengthened regardless of the many obstacles faced by the population. And today, in light of all the events in the region, the community identity has been further strengthened and even reached a sectarian stage between Sunnis and Shiite. Therefore, any solution of the existentialist crisis in Lebanon must take into consideration this reality confessional of the religious communities in Lebanon. And these realities, these confessional realities, shape the identity and personality of the Lebanese population. So any solution has to take into consideration this reality, this community reality that goes back to, if you want, to the 7th century, and which has deep roots in the social reality of Lebanon. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Touma, for this very interesting historical background and shedding light on the rooting of our identity, the identity of peoples living in this land, and mainly to highlight the pejorative meaning of confessionalism in Lebanon, which is very often the source of misunderstanding between Lebanon and other cultures. I think of the Western culture. So I will hand over the word to Mr. Amin Iskandar. Welcome, Dr. Iskandar. I'm very happy to have you as our guest and colleagues. Please go ahead.
Hi, Sandra. Hello, everyone. So Iyad Bustani here with us and I are part of an organization called Tul Lebanon, Mount Lebanon in Syria. And it is striving for the revival of our Syriac language. Today's Lebanese is a dialect of Syriac that was the language taught in our Mount Lebanese schools up till the 1940s. Why is language such an important ingredient in the elaboration and building of a nation? The genesis of the concept of culture as related to people's identity starts mainly in the end of the 18th century and developed during the 19th century with the Romantic German philosophers. Their ideas were also carried by their French counterparts like Ernest Renan, who gave a conference in 1882 entitled, "What is a Nation? Qu'est-ce qu'une nation?" French literature helped spread these ideas to the Balkan, Russia, Lebanon, Armenia, etc. So it is important to describe this notion of nation as understood by the Romantic movement. I would like to start with Emanuel Swedenborg. He was a Swedish philosopher, but he inspired the German Romantics. He wrote in 1771, "Germany is divided into more governments than the neighboring kingdoms. However, a common genius prevails everywhere among people speaking the same language." So we notice the intimate relation between language and identity. Even when a country is not united, language can become the cement. Johan van Herder will develop the idea of importance of language for identity. Once he writes, "One can only think if one has a language." And therefore he is linking the striving of people and their goals with language. That was Johan van Herder. Now, Johann Fichte will link this concept to the idea of nation. Language is the most important component for cultural specificity and therefore for nation. He writes a letter to the German nation and he says, "The first original and truly natural boundaries of a state are beyond doubt their internal boundaries. Those who speak the same language are joined to each other by a multitude of invisible bonds by nature herself." And he adds further, "And in the natural view of things, it is not because men dwell between certain mountains and rivers that they are a people, but on the contrary, men dwell together because they were a people already by a law of nature, which is much higher. There are indeed other mountains and other rivers in the Levant, in Arabia, in North Africa. It did not create a specificity nor an autonomous mountain like in Lebanon, like the one Michel was just talking about. Here, there is more than a mountain. There is a language and a religious culture emphasizing a particular and specific identity. In 1820, Wilhelm von Humboldt declares, the diversity of languages is not a diversity of signs and sounds, but a diversity of views of the world. This means that by changing the language of someone, we can change his way of understanding the world and the perception he has of himself and of his own society. We can convince him that he belongs to a different society and make him adopt foreign causes and foreign battles as being his own cause. He can destroy his own society for the benefit of another. We know how much language is important in our way of thinking, in our way of building our idea of the world and of ourselves, thanks to several studies all through the 19th and 20th century, like the hypothesis of linguistic relativity, also known as the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, that says the structure of a language affects its speaker's cognition and relation to the world. And from the same period, we know Ludwig Wittgenstein, who says the limits of my language mean the limits of my world, the planet. All this leads us to the most explicit relationship between language and nation. Which one comes first, nation or language? Let us consider the examples of Cyprus that made the choice of Greek and of Malta that fixed its Arabized Canaan dialect full of Italian, French, and English words, exactly like our Lebanese. The people of Cyprus and of Malta fixed their linguistic identity to establish for themselves the foundations of their political immunity, an immunity that clearly lacks in Lebanon. Language and nation are so intimately related that one doesn't go without the other. A language without a country could disappear. But this is also the case of a country without a language. Contrary to what we think in Lebanon, language is identity, and English is an identity for America. Let me explain. Portuguese is an identity and a Latin Catholic culture for Brazil. Spanish is an identity and a Latin Catholic culture for Argentinians. A language can be adopted as long as it reflects the culture, faith, religion, history, and identity of a country and of its people. For Max Weinreich, language is a dialect with an army and a navy. Without the conscious willing to establish a nation, a dialect doesn't evolve to become a language the way it did in Malta, and the way Syriac language was created consciously by the first Christians of the Levant. Lebanese and Maltese are both exactly the same. One of them, however, was established as a language, while the other was politically limited as a dialect, not even of its own Syriac origin, but as a dialect or even a deterioration of Arabic. Now we come to the principles of the 1943 agreement or Pacte National in Lebanon. I would like to remind that German Romanticism opposes the thesis known as contractual, contractuelle of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Emmanuel Kant, Jean Baudin, Henri Benjamin Constant, to whom society organizes around the social contract, le pacte social, by a simple agreement between social components and the surrender of some freedoms, exactly the way the Mount Lebanese people surrendered their history, language, and identity in a social contract in 1943. After abandoning their identity, they started abandoning their rights to have a space that expresses this identity. The social contract of 1943 had to lead necessarily, inexorably, to the Cairo agreements in 1969 with the full surrender of Lebanon's legitimacy. How to build a nation with several peoples, each one with its own myth, beliefs, faith, or narrative known as roman national. The Republic for Aristotle is based on the community, koinonia, not on a people, ethnos. This means that you need to have a people with the same faith, aspirations, and vision that is able to act as a community. So imagine establishing a republic with not only several communities, but a multitude of peoples from different origins and backgrounds. What happened in Lebanon or in the Christian Levant in general? What brought us to this impasse today, this deadlock situation? During the second half of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was in serious decline and known as the sick man. This is when the Judeo-Christian people under Ottoman occupation for centuries started to get prepared to rise again. The first step was to revive their dying languages. This is why we have today modern Greek, modern Hebrew, Armenian, Serb, and even Syriac. Yes, indeed, in Upper Mesopotamia, Naum Faye had started a revival of that language with the printing of newspapers in Syria. But Arabism made its way for the Christians of the Levant. Most of them started reviving Arabic instead of Syriac. They excelled and made this literature and culture flourish beautifully, there is no doubt, but at the same time, they abandoned the language that could express more deeply and more genuinely their needs, their views, their aspirations, their identity, faith, and existence. This led inexorably to what Battier called le dernier chant du cygne, the swan song announcing a certain death. But all Mount Lebanese schools kept on teaching Syriac, and the Maronite Church kept on using it for all its masses. The fatal rupture would only happen in 1943. Actually, it was in the 19th century that the nation states, as we know them today, started appearing. The German Empire was declared the Galerie des Glaces in Versailles in 1871. And this is when Germany started existing as a nation state. Italy, it was in 1861. Mount Lebanon, 1860. Mount Lebanon became an independent, or let's say autonomous country, and recognized by the European powers in 1860. It was even defined as a nation state by Prince Richard von Metternich. Now, who is von Metternich? Clemens von Metternich, or Prince of Metternich, was the Austrian Empire's foreign minister and then chancellor. And he suggested the concept of Qa'im Maqamiyya in Mount Lebanon in 1841. And as we all know, it was a total failure. Now, the sustainable solution for Mount Lebanon was found with the governorate of Mount Lebanon, called in Ottoman Turkish, the Mutsarrifiyya. Its constitution was called the Règlement Organique, in English, Solution Based on Nations. And it was developed by Clemens' son, who is Richard von Metternich, who was ambassador of Austria at the court of Napoleon III, whose army maintained security in Lebanon in 1860. Richard von Metternich noted the fundamental differences between the people of Mount Lebanon and the rest of Ottoman Syria. He talks about a clear cultural specificity. He proposed, therefore, a geographical and political system adapted to this reality. It was known as the Beyoğlu Protocol and valid for 3 years, and became final in 1864 with a federal system that makes even use of the word canton that terrorizes everybody today. The concept of organic in its constitution refers to the idea of nations based on cultural groups developed in 19th century Europe by German Romantic movements, as we just explained. It reached Lebanon directly with Prince of Metternich and with European powers, but also through the French culture of the Maronites and the Maronite Church. Now, French writers had also a direct influence. As soon as 1860, Ernest Renan arrived with the soldiers of Napoleon III, and Ernest Renan, with Jules Michelet, upon others, played a predominant role in the French spreading of German Romanticism concerning identity. And in 1864, Ernest Renan, well aware of the specific identity of Mount Lebanese people, wrote, sous le nom de Syriaque, et identifié avec le dialecte des populations du Liban, le Phénicien traversa le Moyen Âge. Under the name of Syriac, and identified with the dialect of the populations of Lebanon, Phoenician crossed the Middle Ages. Another French diplomat, Robert de Quay de Saint-Amour, had noticed these fundamental differences. And therefore, when he saw the fabric, how Grand Liban was built, he proposed for Grand Liban in 1920, a political system that is adapted to this diversity. The fundamental understanding of the concept of continuity underlined by Ernest Renan when he talked about Syriac language was rejected by the official history books under Shar al-Khoury, who imposed a fraudulent identity and erased the genuine memory. He created an orphan society and suppressed the foundations of the nation. What was unconscious during the beginning of the 20th century with the Nahda turned into premeditated act in 1943. The Syriac language was simply sacrificed on the altar of Greater Lebanon. It was not recognized as one of the national languages of the new entity. As a result, mountain schools in 1960s stopped teaching Syriac when the last language teachers retired. And of course, the Syriac Maronite Church saw itself forced to hold Mass in Arabic. Imagine, to make a comparison, imagine proud countries like Italy or Poland would today suddenly decide not to teach their own language anymore under the pretext that it is useless. Useless because nobody else in the world understands Polish or Italian. So why to teach Polish and Italian in our schools? This is exactly what happened and what is happening now in Lebanon. Paul Valéry wrote « J'appelle Europe toute terre qui a été romanisée, christianisée et soumise à l'esprit de discipline des Grecs. » In English, every race and land that has been successively Romanized, Christianized, and as regards the mind, disciplined by the Greeks, is absolutely European. As we know, Lebanon has been Romanized. the School of Law in Beirut, Christianized, we are Christians, and disciplined by the Greeks. We had an agora in every Phoenician city. But Ottomanism and later Arabism with Bashar al-Khoury worked on the transformation of the Mediterranean or Levantine identity and reality of the Mount Lebanese people to drown them in their own view of the Middle East. Bashar al-Khoury, yes, was backed by powerful Maronite parties and families. Indeed, remember that, as Arnold Toynbee puts it, civilizations die from suicide, not by murder. Mount Lebanon's people were killed by identity usurpation. In fact, Milan Hubble said, the first step in liquidating a people is to erase its memory, destroy its books, its culture, its history, then have somebody write new books, manufacture a new culture, invent a new history. Before long, the nation will begin to forget what it is and what it was. Mount Lebanon is the perfect illustration and the living example of this theory. Lebanese people learn in their schools and universities everything but their own history and their language. Because what better way to annihilate a people but to make its language vanish? Allow me to conclude now with these two following quotes. The first from Michel Serres. He says, because after all, language defines the genius of a people, and to abandon one's language is an unforgivable crime. And Rémy de Gourmont, when a people no longer dares to defend its language, it is ripe for slavery. Thank you.
Thank you, Amin. Thank you, Amin, for this very, very interesting expose. Sad, but so true. Thank you for the focus on the linguistic identity of this country. And what can we say? Yes, we forgot our language. And you have in Tour Lebanon, I may say that you are the president of Tour Lebanon, and Tour Lebanon is an organization, NGO for rehabilitating the Syriac language in Lebanon. And I'm very happy to follow your post on Facebook and learn so much about the origin of our Lebanese dialect, which has nothing to do with the Arab language. And so, yes, the power of language. This is, I think, we underestimate the power of language in the world. So true. So now I will just make a parenthesis about maybe my subject, my observation about the revolution. I studied the revolution, the so-called revolution of October 2019, the uprising, the popular uprising, and I saw something very, very particular. That the first weeks, everybody it was the honeymoon phase, and people were highly tempted to follow the group and leave behind their traditional social bond and form one and unique family, a nation, the country. So they truly and honestly believe that they can get rid of the old regime, and create a new, bigger family, leaving behind their communities and political parties. So they were sincere. They had sincere intentions However, the honeymoon ends and the illusion was blocked by the bitter reality and divisions. And subgroups surface again. So we underground, the first days we were, the places, the roads were full of people, and then slowly the number decreases, and we end up with few people and groups. So we had one group on this road facing another group in another road, and so we do not longer have this honeymoon, this happy one big family united. So I was wondering what happened and why. And when we study the psychology of groups, we can see that we have groups coexisting and facing each other, and each group has its own identity with its own codes, lexic, signs, dress code. So when we went to the on the road, we can recognize this community from their from their shirts, the black shirts, and we name them the black shirts. So these are signs they use to insist on their identity. And then we had another group with other signs and proud of their signs. So each the groups, the former group, divided into several groups, and after 1 or 2 months, we end up with the same initial situations, groups, communities facing each other, and it was no longer a group. So this was it is the impossible revolution. Why? Because we had the identity, the belonging to, the fear of leaving our home, our political parties, not even political parties, our community. We have a secular culture. We cannot leave it. So each group went back to his family. So that's why we are in a dead end situation. And what can we do today? We have to go back, maybe to the roots of the problem. We have our cards. We have maybe to think again of the national pact. Can we? The question is it possible to not to have a shared identity, but yet build a nation? We all acknowledge that we have different identities, different peoples living on the same land. How can we, with different identities, put them aside and build a nation? Is it possible? Is it possible to agree on common goals if we don't have a common identity, common values, and common goals? Can we build a nation in that case? This is the question we can think about. So I will let maybe Iyad shed the light on. Iyad, hello.
Of course, I'm here.
And maybe can you talk about your topic you worked on how can we, with many different identities and multicultural communities, coexist to avoid having violence every now and then, so maybe 10 years we have a cycle of violence, either as political, economical crisis like today, or as like the civil war we experienced 15, 20 years ago. So can you suggest something, Iyad?
Well,
work on this topic.
Thanks, Sandra, and thanks, Jumana, for this amazing webinar we're having here. And I'm impressed, and I love what I've been listening to, Amin, Michelle, and I'll try to shed some light, a bit, maybe a different angle, but to try to complete the picture surrounding the identity, the identity concept, and how it unfolds in a social environment. First of all, we know from anthropologists that identity can be individual or collective. So you have the individual identity and you have a collective identity. And this, in today's world, is becoming extremely interesting because of a new phenomena out there that is called identity politics. We can talk about that in a second. It is not at all what you think it is. It has nothing to do with identity in the as understood in the Levant, but it is a very interesting development in societies globally, westernized society, including here in Lebanon. I'll touch on this, but what I want to say at this stage is that so identity can be either individual or collective. Now, what is a collective identity? It has been defined by the likes of Selim Abu or Claude Lévi-Strauss or even Huntington as being a group's common views of their relationship with the earth, the environment, the alterity, the other, and the deities or the cosmic order. So an identity is that set of shared values, if you want, that a group of people agree upon amongst themselves and carry, and they use it to try to give sense to their lives. Because what an identity is a vector of is the meaning. And the meaning is what we are all in quest of. We're trying to give meaning to our lives, individually or collectively. That meaning is not necessarily religious at all. It can be in a consuming society through consumption, in a religious society through religion. So it can have various shapes, but it all based on it allows. Identity is a means to actually try to give sense to our lives, and hence is a necessity for life. It allows us to understand what is prohibited and what is allowed, what is possible and what is not, what is the common set of values and benchmark by which we operate in society, who are our saints and who are our demons, how do we read the past, the present, and the future. So all of these, through all of these, identity is very linked to what is called the national narrative. Because identity is collective, as I said, it immediately imposes what is called the national narrative. And the national narrative is one specific reading of history. It's not a question of right or wrong. It is only one reading of history. Just to give an example, if you take Waterloo, Waterloo is a defeat for the French and a victory for the Anglo-Prussian. So it's the same set of events that are read differently by different people, and it's part of how they believe those events unfolded. If you take in the more Levantine context, the Yarmouk battle, which is the first battle by which the Arabo-Muslim powers toppled the Byzantine Empire at the time, the Roman Empire at the time. So that war is a factual event, but one community, quote unquote, reads it as a defeat, while the other read it as a victory. So that's, or you take the Crusades. The Crusades is viewed as a liberation by some and as a domination by others. So this links what is called the identity to the national narrative. Now, having established that fact, we need to go back to that founding moment in our modern history, which is 1864, the time at which federal constitution was devised by the likes of Richard von Metternich, as Amin said, for Lebanon. And that 1864 constitution was that of 4 nations, 4 national narratives. Hence the title of the constitution, Règlement Organique, the solution through the nation. We all know the organic romanticism, organic nationalism. So and in the Ottoman powers, and in Turkish Ottoman, we were the populations of these country of the Levant were segmented by what is called a millet. A millet is a nation, be it in Ottoman itself, in the Turkish language, or the way it was perceived by the European powers, or the way by the local populations perceived as themselves. So we were in a situation where in facing 4 different national narratives, the 1864 constitution came up with a federal constitution that allowed these 4 nations to actually coexist. And there's a book called The Long Peace that was just published in Oxford, written by a Turkish scholar, researcher, that describes well that long peaceful period. And obviously one of the recommendations of that book is that the Ottoman Empire would have maybe survived had he expanded that Lebanese experiment, that Règlement Organique, throughout the various nations under the Ottoman Empire. So, but if we fast forward from that founding event to the 1926 constitution, which was that first sort of a centralized model constitution, mainly driven by the French ideas of a nation state. What was in the 1864 constitution identified as a nation was later labeled as a community, as a religious community. So the millet, which means a nation, and was so in the 1864 constitution, was translated in the 1926 constitution as a community, a sect, a religious community. And therefore, from somebody, for an individual who was, who sort of had a love for his nation, what used to be called patriotism then would be called sectarianism. What was a positive became a negative. That is one of the dire consequences of that change in semantics. But also there's another one that is even more appalling, is the fact that at the time where you had 4 national narratives that went deep in that were deeply rooted in history, the new concept of 1926 came up with a new nation, which was common to all, which was Lebanon, rather than the four nation identities which composed the federation, not Sarfia federation. So that new Lebanon lacked a national narrative to support it, and therefore it was asked by the authorities at the time, from the historian and the scholars, to actually devise a sort of binding national narrative, common national narrative, which they did by sort of dating it back to the Phoenicians, because that was pre-religions. And then we, as all of those who had who were schooled in Lebanon know it, we study the Phoenicians, and then there's a 15th centuries gap, and then we start with Fakhruddin II, which is the founding father of the modern Lebanese, which is around 16th century prince. So it simply erased from our memories the 15th century that are common to all of us, each, but are separate because they are identified per national narrative. So in the attempt to actually create that joint cemented narrative for one single country in the 1926 constitution, we actually had to cut down on people's identities and sort of try to forge a new one. And that new one actually did not fly, because it proved to be, to a certain extent, fictitious, or at least viable only to one of those national identities and not the others. So now we're sort of in that situation where having tampered with identity, having tampered with national narratives, we are in a failed state situation, and that is obvious to all. And maybe if I want to sort of give some anthropological, historical analysis of why we are in that situation of a failed state, maybe because the concept of modern Lebanon was designed by entities, by communities, call it, or nations, that perceive their journey through history very differently. I'll give some examples. During the Middle Ages, as Lebanon was under the Latin kingdoms of the Levant, the Crusades, we were part. All the Western Hemisphere was part of what is called Res Publica Christiana. This is Saint Augustine Saint Thomas main contribution to the political philosophy about this Res Publica Christiana, that was one republic governing all the parts of the Christian realm. As the Crusades rolled back out of the Levant, obviously the sort of the history for us freezed at that point, whereas it continued in Europe through very, very interesting key milestones. And the first one I would want to mention here is Oxford Peace, 1555, within the middle of the German Civil War, if you want, or the Catholic Protestant Civil War. Oxford Peace enshrined a new concept that is cuius regio, eius religio, and therefore the people had to be of their same common religious faith as their prince or their leadership, more broadly. Now, this is very interesting concept, because that concept, powerful as it is, traveled to the Levant as well, because of the how to say the migration of ideas within the realm of Christianity. And as we know, in 1697, one of the prominent Emir family in the Mount Lebanon, the Shihab, converted to Christianity themselves because they could not convert their population in application of that specific cuius regio eius religio concept. And they dominated, obviously, the Mount Lebanon as being Maronites, and they converted from Sunni. So that this is one key milestone where the notion of a nation, as we know it, as has been later on conceptualized, started emerging in the Western space realm, Christian realm. The second, obviously, was Westphalia, which itself as well was a major contribution to at some point the fragmentation of Europe, but also the cementing of the peace based on what later became national identities. Now that evolution was partially translated in the Levant, and even to a certain extent in the millet concept under the Ottoman Empire. Obviously, Islam does not know the concept of a nation as we know it, because there is under Islam one single nation, which is the Ummah. But very interestingly, the Ottoman Empire was sort of lenient, and maybe to some extent, because it came later than Christianity, more lenient towards Christian than the Christian were towards Islam in a certain extent, obviously in a submissive way, a dimitude way, but still, whereby it allowed the identification of nation within the empire. That is very similar to, I would say, the Roman Empire in Europe and its components, which were nation states. So that evolution of that concept that flew to the Levant, that traveled to the Levant, enabled us to develop that identity that was well described by Amin and Michel, but also I would add to it the fact that we, as different nations in this part of the world, evolve differently, not necessarily better than the other, but differently. And I want to quote here one element of the identity, which is secularity. Secularity is a very interesting concept. Secularity derives from Latin, secularum, and secularum is was first theorized by Saint Augustine in 426 in the City of God, whereby he was trying to explain how the church was meant to manage the spiritual aspect of life, and it would leave to the emperor, i.e. the governor, the management of whatever changes with time. And this is exactly the meaning of secularum, whatever changes with time, meaning everything that is non-spiritual. And this was the founding principle of the segregation of church and state. Obviously, that idea travels with the Christian communities in the Levant, but also in Europe, and it developed the way we know it developed. But what I'm trying to say here is that it's not part of Islam's concept, be it Sunni, Shia, or even a Druze, which is not necessarily Islam, but political philosophy. And therefore, when we talk about secularity in the Levant, that concept resonates well with the Christian because it draws back to their own understanding or set of beliefs, but it doesn't necessarily apply to the others. And therefore, we need to build that entity that allows, in French we would say a géométrie variable, that variable components to allow societies to evolve at their own pace and in accordance with their own sets of beliefs. Now, fast forwarding again to the 1864 Federal Constitution and later the 1926, and the demise of modern Lebanon. As we try to roll back and understand why we came to this point, and we realized that we missed a couple of key points that could be openings to a better future, built on solid grounds. One of which is subsidiarity. Principe de subsidiarité, is a major cornerstone of the German constitution or the Swiss constitution, and it was very well developed initially in 1891 by Pope Leon XIII in Rerum Novarum. His encyclical detailed that from a Christian perspective, and I'm talking identity, obviously not necessarily faith here, people are best served when they make their own decisions at the nearest level of the decision making. Now, that concept of subsidiarity was later developed by P11 in Quantigiano Anno, the 40 years anniversary of Rerum Novarum, and was magistrally developed by John Paul II together with Kenneth Arrow, the Nobel Prize winning in economics, in Centesimus Annus, yet another encyclical that develops that concept of subsidiarity. And subsidiarity could be a key element in the rebirth of a new Lebanon, whereby we would revisit our sort of Jacobin French constitutional framework into something that is much more similar to the German/Swiss model, based on the principe de subsidiarité, whereby we would empower local authorities, be it municipality and later cantonal powers before a federal government, to address the lack of governance within the system as a whole. But also that second leg of our major problem is the management of our cultural diversity. And the way to manage cultural diversity is by enabling local democracy. But democracy, as we all know it, and Tocqueville explained it quite well, is the dictatorship of the majority. It's the dictatorship of the 51%. Now, if you apply that concept of the dictatorship, the democracy, as a dictatorship of the 51% on a multicultural constituency, you end up with a dictatorship point. Why? Because a key element, first of all, because in a multicultural setting, the majority does not share the same social pact as the minority, and therefore it will crowd it out of the system. Secondly, because when you say democracy, you always need to think about the possible alternates in power. You need to have a chance to actually win over that 51%. In a multicultural setting, you never have the chance to actually take over unless you have a demographic shift from one constituency to the other. So you cannot take, say, 70% Christian and 30% Shia constituency and say, I'm going to apply democracy, because 70% will remain, 70% are going to crush that 30% of their own, on their own sets of beliefs. So call it dress code, call it alcohol, call it way of life, call it whatever you want. So what we need to do is build the concept of local democracy by national narrative. So amongst the people that share those four national narratives that compose Lebanon and were sort of fictitiously put aside in the 1926 constitution and later on, and which obviously led to the demise of Lebanon. So, and I'm gonna end by saying that by combining the principe de subsidiarité as developed in the Doctrine Sociale de l'Église and as enshrined in the 3rd and 5th articles of the Swiss Constitution. I think it's the 10th in the German, and it is also in the European Constitution, by enabling a very, very strong decentralization, political and administrative, not only administrative, because that's the end of any minority in any region. So by combining the strengths of the democracy as we know it, the rule of the 51% within one koinonia, the community, and the principe de subsidiarité, we can come up with a viable system of a multicultural society that could live in peace and harmony for hopefully another century. I want to end up by saying that what André Malraux said in the 60s, that le 21e siècle sera religieux ou ne sera pas. The 21st century will either be religious or will not be. What he meant to say, obviously, was not talking about religion as a belief system. He was talking about what Huntington later called, a few decades later, called the clash of civilization. And clearly, Europe, Lebanon Lebanon was on the frontier of that conflict, but also Europe today is at the frontier of that conflict. So what we need to do is to find a viable system that will ultimately take us from that, prove to be a viable model of a multicultural society that is able to live in peace and harmony for that model to be replicable in any society where those conflicts are arising or about to arise. So I will end with this, and I thank you so much for this great webinar.
Thank you, Iyad. Thank you so much. That was a very interesting approach. Thank you all of Michel, Amin, and Iyad. So to round it up, we have the different aspects of identity: historical, religious, linguistic, spiritual, individual, and collective. And we're living, so coexisting or living side by side. And how can we build a nation? Is it possible to build a nation? That was the initial questions. So we'll take maybe some questions. We need, Jumana, a mini webinar to answer all the questions, and we have so many questions.
Well, I'm ready as can be.
This is very interesting and very d'actualité. So can we take the first question, maybe addressed to Amin?
Yes, there's already a question from Mara Hanna.
Oui, Mara Hanna. How is the Syriac language, Christian Syrians, different from the Ashuri, Christian Iraqis? Would each then constitute a separate identity based on the language dialect? Please, Amin.
I didn't hear the beginning of the question.
How is the Syriac language, Christian Syrians, different from the Ashuri?
It is not. It is not. This is the same language. It was developed by the Christians of Lebanon, Christian Syria, that is now in Turkey, and Upper Mesopotamia. They developed this language as a Christian language, and each one of them calls it their own way. For example, in the Syriac part of Turkey, they say it's Aramaic. In Upper Mesopotamia, they say it's Assyrian. And in Lebanon, Ernest Renan considered it like the Christian Phoenician. Each one gives it its own name, but actually it's the same language, at least the written one. The written one is exactly the same. We write the same thing, but then we have dialects. Assyrian is a dialect of it. Lebanese is a dialect of it. At least it was 100 years ago. Now it was very much Arabized since 43, and especially after Ta'if. But 100 years ago, it was a dialect of Syriac. But those are dialects. But when we write exactly the same language, us here in Lebanon, and the Syriac Orthodox in southern Turkey, and the Assyrian Chaldeans in Upper Mesopotamia.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I have one question. Someone sent it via my phone. The question is whether the community leaders, this is the question for Michel. The question is whether the community leaders or Za'im are ready to let go of their followers as they are their asset or capital, to allow for the birth of the institutions and the central government. So basically, can the followers leave their Za'im, their leaders, or is it a difficult task for them?
I don't know if I understood the question.
The
but
question can the followers leave behind their Za'im? Is it a possibility the Za'im will be jobless if he doesn't have the followers?
I think that the confessional identity is not related to the Za'im. We can put aside all the Zaims and the leaders. It would not abolish the confessional identity. I think there is not a relation between the fact to follow a leader, a confessional leader, and the confessional identity.
What would you put in Za'im? What would you put in the word Za'im, so used among the people? So it's like a pejorative word. You are following your Za'im. What do you put? Maybe the question is for all of you. What would you put in the word Za'im?
I think maybe the Za'im is more related to the familial identity or clanic identity, not the confessional. You know, the big families and the big political families, they have the Za'im and the members of this big family, and they follow the Za'im. Like the Jumblat. Jumblat is a big political family. They have one Za'im. He is the leader of this big family. But as far as confessionalism is concerned, I don't think that it is related to a Za'im. The confessional identity is not linked, I think, to a specific Za'im.
Yes, but maybe he reinforces the Asabiyya you were talking about.
Yeah, maybe, yeah.
It's a part of the Asabiyya.
Yes. I can answer this question from my approach, the one that I work on.
Yes.
You know that in the 19th century, it was said, I don't know, Iyad will correct me if it was Lamartine or de Nerval, I can't remember. He said, In Egypt, I saw a strong man. In Lebanon, I saw a people. C'était, je sais plus qui c'était.
In Lebanon, I see
a people.
A people. A people. Lamartine, je pense.
Il y a un peuple, alors qu'il y avait Ibrahim en Égypte, c'était un homme. Egypt was strong because there was a man, in Lebanon, a people. Now, Lebanon became a weak country where you need to have a man, a Zahim. When you have a strong man to lead the nation, then everything is perfect. When you don't find the man, there is nothing, and Lebanon collapses and disappears. This is the perfect illustration of a country that has nothing to cement it together. There is no identity, there is nothing. When you see the Greeks, how they confronted the Nazis, the Greeks, how they confronted the Italian fascism, how they confronted the Ottomans. The Greeks alone could confront the entire Ottoman Empire. They didn't need a man. Their identity, their language, and their culture was enough to be their cause and to put them all together. We were like this in the 19th century. We are not anymore. And today, as long as we don't put back in place an identity, a culture, a language, everything that makes a people, we will always need to be tribes behind each one his Zaim. This is how it goes. And the Zaim do everything, not to us work, as Iyad was saying, on the principe de subsidiarité that involve a certain decentralization. They will never let us work on reviving the culture. They will do everything to be our only hope.
Maybe there's another, the way I read that this question is maybe related to the fact that in a multicultural setting, the Zaim is essential because of Maslow's pyramid, and security is the founding element of the in the absence of in a centralized state where power sharing is actually devious. The people find their strength through their they behave viscerally, and they do not look they do not how to say they are not put in let me rephrase it differently. In the system that we are living in, the political elite is an expression of that centralized system they're in, and the way it governs is by fear, is actually by ensuring that the central system government has weak resources to fulfill its roles. So in the absence of that, in the paralysis of that government system that is centralized and is mutually paralyzed, the average citizen has to find his way through the system, the maze of the system. And the only way he can do so is first to actually rely on that political figure that has access through that maze, which is the central government, and allows the supply of what is called in Europe the public goods, meaning the infrastructure. So this is why you need that figure. And the second reason you need that figure is to ensure security. When I'm put in a position where I vote to two Christian leaders, for instance, if I'm Christian, then well, I'll choose the less corrupt, the most educated, etc., etc. But when I'm put in a position where I need to choose between, let's say, a Christian and a Muslim, or a Muslim, a Shia is put in a position to choose between a Sunni or a Shia, or a Druze is put in a position where he needs to choose between this and that, he would unequivocally choose his own, irrespective of the level of corruption, irrespective of the level of education, etc., etc. And this is one of the key elements in the system. So where we need those dying figures for two reasons. One, to provide us with security, because whatever that my own thief is going to steal, it's fine. It's a tax I'm willing to pay for the security of my kids and the survival of my community. And hence, that Zaim establishment is very, very linked to the poor governance system in place, which is called the centralized Arabist system in Lebanon. So actually, it's the system that generates the political elite. And if you want to change the political elite, you don't change names. You don't remove Mr. X and Mr. Y, because worse will come. And a devil you know is much better than a devil you don't. But what you need to change is the system that has generated that political elite. So the Zaim concept is a 20th century emanation of that flawed monolithical centralized system that forces the average individual to seek refuge within one of those people that have their access through the centralized government and can enable the supply of public goods. Let's say a very basic thing. I want a license to drill a well, or to get a permit, or whatever. Be it prohibited or not, doesn't matter. If it's not prohibited, it takes ages and a lot of corruption. If it's prohibited, well, it's prohibited. In both cases, I'll go to the guy that is definitely corrupt human being, but will make happen whatever I need, my permit, my well, my whatever. So on top of providing me with the cultural security, he is providing me with my share of the central government. So I think this is where it comes.
Yes, I will maybe add something. Thank you, Iyad. Very interesting. To summarize it, the Zaim is a father figure. He's the law. So instead of the law being in the state and the rules of the state, the laws are in the hand of the father. And the group, in psychology, the group is the mother. It's like the womb, the uterus is the mother. And so people are the children. So we don't discuss the father authority. We are in a situation where we don't discuss the father authority, whether it is wrong or right, his authoritarian or authoritative or dictator or a dictator. We abide by his rules. That's why we don't question the father figure. So, and this is like the king. So there is a king and the kingdom. And this brings us back to the identity. Are we willing to choose another figure, another father figure? No, we keep our father.
I have a thing here to say, if I may. Amin, you said earlier something that sounded quite pessimistic to me. You said you had nothing in common. I'm afraid I don't agree with you. We have grief in common. We often shared grief. And when it happened back in 2005, we were able to come down to take to the streets as one man, 1.5 million Lebanese people as one. And we were able to do something with it. So I don't actually agree with you. We do share grief every now and then. And I think this is quite a good beginning for a national identity, don't you think?
I think we have something great in common. We are all human beings, and we live in the same area. This is what we have in common: living in the same area and being human beings. But I don't believe at all the grief in 2005, and I don't believe that we were all down for the same reason.
We probably weren't, but we did something. And when you talk about you and the other speakers, when you talk about our impossibility to form some sort of a majority, I think we do. And I think we had some sort of a majority back in 2005, but we weren't able to take it to the next level and to govern as we were supposed to?
Because we can't, because it's impossible, because everyone was there for his own reasons, and it was a very it was a short period in time where we could meet, and it couldn't go further. The same people I saw in 2005 around me insulting Syria, I saw them later when the revolution started in Syria, carrying the Syrian flag and running towards the Serai to put the Syrian flag on it. Before that, in 2005, I saw the same people insulting Syria. So I don't believe at all in this. I think that the way Iyad is presenting it is a much more realistic thing, to accept the fact that each millet, each people has its own way of seeing things and its own needs. And we should find a political system that will help each of these components to reach its goals in respect to the others. And once again, we will always have in common that we are all human beings and all living in the same area, and that we have to find this solution. But by running all together in a romantic way and shouting in the same streets, it was a big lie. I was there, and I can tell you that it was nothing but a big lie. And I wouldn't like to go into the reasons now, but everybody knows now that doesn't work.
We'll schedule another seminar for this.
But Jumana, can I put a word?
Of course, please go ahead. And then there's Nicolas Shekhani who has a question.
Very quickly, just to say that I think we have a lot in common, actually, apart from being human beings, obviously. We have genetics in common. That's for one. And that Professor Pierre Zerloua has demonstrated that we're all literally Phoenicians, and it has been proven, it's done, and we're different from our neighboring environment deep in the interland, and we're now all of that debate is, but we have this common denominator, which is genetics. Second, I would want to say that there are two verbs in French that would how to say, define well our how we can work together, is the verbs être et avoir. What we have, and this is something that we can and must put in common in order to perform better. And when I mean avoir, it means capital, brain power, labor power, cultural trait. So there's a lot of genetics, a lot of things that we have in common that we can put together. What we need to manage independently is être, what we are, identity. So these are personal / communal matters that each group has to manage separately. So if we find a system that allows us to put together our avoir, what we have, and keep managing separately what we are, our être, our national narratives, then we would be in a good position to rebuild a thriving country. I want to take you back to the times where Alexandre le Grand was attacking Tyre. So it was around 330 before Christ. But that time, Sidon, which was its competitor, and yet shared the same gods, etc., stood with Alexander against Tyre. So just to tell you that we are localist people. We have a lot in common, and Sidon and Tyre dominated the Mediterranean. Sidon with Egypt and Greece, and Tyre all the Western Mediterranean. So from Carthage or Lampsis in Libya down to Cadix and even to Ireland. So all I want to say is that localist people are the way they are, and this is how we are. And by putting together what we have and managing separately what we are, we can build a good country, a performing country, and a thriving country.
Thank you, Iyad. Thank you for your answer. Can we take another question?
Yes, I have a small question. In fact, clarification more than a question. First, I would like to say hi to my both friends, Amin and Iyad, very dear friends of mine. We've been doing so many things together to make this country a better world. But I have a small question about the Za'im, his existence, why the people follow the Za'im, what are the reasons, little bit the father that you discussed, Madam, also. I tried, in order to find solution, you need to understand the problem. So after a lot of thoughts with some friends, we reached the level that people follow the Za'im because they are afraid of disappearing. The fear factor of every component in the society will bring you to connect to a strong factor that allows you to exist. Okay. Now, assuming that the fear factor is coming from the fact that there is no strong state that is fulfilling its duty to serve its taxpayers or its people. And that's why the Za'im emerged. And that's why each one will connect and will be strong with his own community as a fear factor to exist, to try to survive, or to get the privilege from the maize to the government. Okay, assuming we do that. And assuming that we are not very close to each other and we need to create a federation, let's say, which I'm not against, by the way, but I need to understand the factors that make it a success. Assuming that we go there, what will guarantee that the state that is failing on the global level will not fail in the sub-level of a federation? Because at the end, the state is the creation of the human being and its laws, and the laws will create the human being like the egg and the chicken. And thank you for getting me to ask this question.
Yes, who would like to answer? Thank you, Mr. Sheikhani.
Can I?
Yes. Sure.
Okay, first I found it came to my mind actually that the nice way to describe a Za'im is a corrupt ombudsman. It's a nice way to actually present that sort of bizarre concept of somebody that can walk you through get you everything you want from central government, provided you pay him handsomely.
Don't go into the كلهم يعني كلهم إياد.
No, of course not. I'm telling you,
don't go there. Not all of them.
The ombudsman is such a powerful concept in Europe. Now imagine a corrupt ombudsman. That's an amazing novelty. I mean, in the history of societies, it could be something very intriguing actually, and an ombudsman that collects votes actually. So you could either pay him in kind or in cash, or pay him in votes. So you go and vote to renew his position. But to answer Nicolas more directly, his question was, if it failed globally, who would? Is there a guarantee that it wouldn't fail locally? There's no guarantees, obviously, but let's look at what makes systems work. What makes system works is there are Nassim Taleb described it very well in a document that he calls Principia Politica, and now he's rebranded it Scala Politica. It's systems are solid when they are built bottom up. So the current system that has failed is a top-down model, whereby there is a central government that has all the features of knowledge and smartness and integrity, and then commands the projects that you need to do here and there. Versus the model that we're talking about, the federal system based on subsidiarity, is bottom up. So, and this is a feature of a sound construct. Second is simplicity. You build the rules as you go. You don't come with overarching detailed principles because you don't know in advance. So this is sort of a second pillar. The third pillar is democracy and direct democracy. Democracy is a powerful tool for decision making. This has been proven everywhere in the world. We don't need to prove it again. But what we fail to see in democracy, democracy being the majority, the dictatorship of the majority. And what we fail to see is it only applies within a koinonia, wherever a community, wherever we try to apply democracy in a multicultural setting, it failed. So we need to allow democracy in terms of that system that cleanses itself and that puts the right person at the right place, but only if we remove that prerequisite layer of the Maslow pyramid, which is fear factor. So because we have a vote democracy within the community, within the four national narratives of the country, then we are able to actually focus on competency, loyalty, honesty, those factors that in the presence of fear we would disregard. If I have a great engineer, honest, decent, smart, to manage my project, my community, my municipality, but he's from a different sect, he's from a different national narrative, I would rather have the corrupt guy of my own. As you all know the anecdote of the head of the CIA talking to Nixon about Salazar, if I recall well, you know, that dictator in Latin America, and telling him he's a son of a bitch, and excuse my French. And Nixon replies, no, he's not. Well, he is indeed, but he's our son of a bitch. So what I'm trying to say is that this is a human being. We have a despicable character, but he's ours, rather than a decent human being, but coming from a different national narrative. And I cannot give him power over my kid's future. I simply cannot. So I'm forced to choose that other guy who comes and talks to my instinct, to my most lower instinct of fear of the other and hatred, and tell me, vote for me because I can crush this other guy and I can make sure that he's dominated. And this is how we all vote. And this is how we absolutely all vote. And the proof of that is that we voted 128 thieves that are in parliament right now. We all voted for them. We all, let's not kid ourselves. So that's reality. So once you remove that fear factor, once you establish local democracy within the community, within those four narratives, meaning Christian voting for Christians, Sunni for Sunni, Shia for Shia, Druze for Druze, then you allow people to put the right man in the right place. And this is how the Swiss democracy was built. And I know the Swiss firsthand, and I can give you a zillion examples about the German as well, but I know it less well. But the Swiss democracy is built bottom up. Even the cantonal powers, if you take, for instance, I'm going to give you a very brief example about the Canton de Berne, which is 85% Protestant and 15% Catholic. There was a civil war for 400 years, and the Bernois, the Jurassiens, were trying to separate from the Bernois because they didn't want to be ruled by that majority. We're talking about Switzerland. In 1975, there was a civil war in Switzerland. Civil war, you Google it, it's not me. By the time the Lebanese civil war broke, the same civil war was happening between the group.
Iyad, a question.
I think
if we narrow, one second, if we narrow everything to the religion, as you are saying, and we have
not the religion, the identity. I don't care whether you get the church or don't.
No, let's say Christian and Muslim and Druze and Shia.
Identities. Just
let me finish. Just let me finish. Okay, we have 18 different religions in Lebanon.
No, we don't have 18.
Assuming, one second. Let me finish, please. Yad, I listened. Let me finish. Assuming we divide it into 4 parts or 3 parts, how are you going to guarantee to the Orthodox that the Maronite will not take over tomorrow? How will you guarantee to the Shia they will not take over the Alawite tomorrow? Nothing is guaranteed. So today, if I follow your concept to the epsilon level, the lowest level, still there is a problem. I do agree with you that the democracy bottom up, when you make it in a smaller identity group, might work better, okay? But still, in Lebanon, it's so complicated.
Wait a second.
Even if you narrow it down,
excuse me, gentlemen. I'm afraid we have to wrap it up. I'm sorry. Perhaps we will have, not perhaps. Of course, we will have other webinars. We will develop this story further. I'd like to grab the opportunity to thank each and every one of you. Thank you so much, Iyad. Thank you, Amin. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Sandra, for taking over and for conducting such a very interesting webinar. Thank you all for being there. Thank you, Emiliano, Gabi, George, Ghalib, Hassan, Camille, Mara, Marilina, Mariam, Mireille, Nicolas, Philippe, Pierre, and so on, and those who left us, Ronald, Pierre, Samir, Tom, Robert. Thank you all for being there. Thank you also for those who were sorry to leave before, and we'll meet some other time.
Jumana, great. Sandra aussi.
Salut.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Nicolas.
Pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you.